Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they did! They absolutely got it right. And this is Tom Navolis, your host, once again being delighted to be with you. With all of the various things that are continuing to happen, I'm sure you're picking up all of the stuff you need to pick up from the mainstream media, and all of the other media and talking heads and all those other various groups that can get out there and just rise to the emotion and rise to the topic at hand. And I think that's important. I think it's important that we have good other forms of coverage, from the Breitbarts to the Hill to the Daily Caller to a number of others that are there that have their different radio programs on the mainstream, or I even call where Hannity and all of them are on Salem Broadcasting, which, if you didn't know, I'm going to let you in on a secret out there, folks. Salem Broadcasting is very much owned by Google. Did I say that? Yeah, and it's true. Go find out. The ones that made the big investments right now into bailing out Salem Broadcasting, a so-called Christian broadcast entity, is owned by Google. And they are helping to direct the programming, whether you realize it or not. So the place where conservative radio, Christian radio, thought that it was safe, how safe is it? How safe will it and can it be when the likes of Google are a very hefty investor now owning a bunch of the debt of Salem Broadcasting? So all of those that are on Salem Broadcasting, I am thankful that they are there and that they can stand in the battle, stand in the fight, and be able to continue to speak freely as long as they have the freedom to speak. But there are those of us who are either on these alternative type of networks like Liberty Works Radio Network, as well as Dr. Mike Spalding's Soaring Eagle Radio, that, or on our private service as I host. Yeah, I know I put things up on YouTube, but that's because, so here's the deal. That the deal is, and where the information comes from, is one of the last sustainability conferences, if you will, in Washington, D.C. this past month. And a business partner of mine who we work together in trying to bring rationality into the sustainability into the corporate environment is one of the things that I do in working with this individual out of the great state of Long Island. Is that, because there's a lot of conservatives in Long Island, not in all of New York, but Long Island, there's a lot of conservatives out there. But the point of it is that at that particular conference, part of the conversation that was being held was that the enemy, that's all they are, is the enemy is funded significantly by all of these major endowments, these tax-exempt foundations like the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the this foundation, the that foundation, which there was a good report done back in the 70s in the Freeman Digest that talked about all of those entities. And they really don't care. They've already been taken over, and they got billions of dollars. So, we always point to Soros as the funder of the evil in America. But the funding of the evil in America has been happening since all of these major foundations have been co-opted by leftists way back when. Actually, the co-opting started in the 60s and some of it before that. But it really got going in the 60s and 70s is when all of that co-opting happened. And if you can see, when was the first time that there were issues around global sustainability? The first conference was back in 1972 up around Vancouver, British Columbia, and so on. So the point is, and why I'm rattling all of that off, is to tell you that I would love to continue to host my videos on my private server or at eaglefiremobile.com, because that's an entity that I'm working with. And that's the place you should go if you're really concerned about your data. If you're concerned about the Google schmoogles, doogles, and everything else, then eaglefiremobile.com is where you need to have your private development information, but go check that out. Anyway, but for me, I use right now to throw my videos up there, and the archives to the program is the communist-owned YouTube. Yeah, it's communist-owned because Google owns it. You know where they are. So until we can fund something different, that's the real nut of the message at the moment, is that all the major patriot groups out there, all of those that are fighting climate change, all of those organizations, that's why you get a gazillion emails from all these different people are going, hey, can you toss me 5? Can you give me 10? And you should be definitely funding Liberty Works Radio Network or Soaring Eagle, because you know what? They're putting the right stuff out correctly as well. But, guys like me, that's what we do. We self-fund this stuff. There's so many people that in the Tea Party movement, in the citizens group movements, and all the various movements that are out there, we're self-funded, folks. Yeah, you got big ones like Tea Party Patriots, or you got this one or that one. But, they don't get the big money. They don't get the corporate money. They do get your money because you're generous enough to participate with those different groups because you believe in them. But when it comes to others like myself, well, we're self-funding. So in relationship to that self-funding is the fact that we're going to talk about a number of different things, especially maybe in the third segment a little bit. But in relationship to that self-funding, we have a lot of information to get out. This takes me to something that I ran into this week. Well, let's step back, because what we always talk about on this program is the mirrors in history. What happened in history, what was going on from our foundational perspective that is relevant today. All of it. All of it. I always say that we are in 1772 all over again, except this time the tyrants and despots are not over in England. They are in Washington, D.C. So those that are on the left coast who really don't care, if you go just by marked miles, it's almost the same distance from, say, Seattle, Washington to Washington, D.C. So with that, we know where our enemy resides. So take it for that. But one of the things that, what do we have, about 5 minutes left, Kath? Something like that?
Almost 7.
Oh, wow. She said 7 minutes. We have 7 minutes. So in this next 7 minutes, what I wanted to introduce you to was from that history and the fact that when we saw that George Whitefield from last week and talking about Dr. Langdon, and I hope that you went and you read Government Corrupted by Vice. I really do. I hope you took the time, because it's just an amazing sermon. It just drives into the critical aspects of what is liberty, what do we need to do, what is going on, folks. And fundamentally, what it really, really, really drives to is the point of God's law. God's law. And that's why I'm titling this program, or did title the program, The Law, Man versus God. And the point on that is that we saw that here it is, George Whitefield, he was coming along and preaching exceptionally well to bring that truth of God into education, into government, into the churches. Hello. And, he was being kept out. He was being kept out by the religious, even those that were teaching the Bible. They were teaching the Bible, but they really didn't want to hear about the law of God. And, it was Governor Belcher that brought him in to Harvard, which impacted then Samuel Adams and none other than our good friend Samuel Langdon. So where's that today in these last few minutes is that I came upon an organization when I was taking and working on updating and rewriting from covenant to the present Constitution. That organization, which is referenced in the archives, referenced in the promo that went out, is none other than Lowlang Institute. Lowlang Institute stands for what? What does Lowlang Institute stand for? Come on, folks, help me out. Help me out. Let's get there. Come on, you can do it. You can do it. No, Lowlang Institute is none other than the laws of nature and nature's God. And that institute takes and is bringing us back historically and organically into those truths of law that was foundationally utilized in America. And the reality and the truth of what has happened in that. And you're going to have to follow me into the second segment for those that are on Soaring Eagle Radio, so that you can pick up on what I'm going to talk about relative to Lowlang Institute. It's LONANG.com. Get that? LONANG.com. Lownang.com. So those that are on Liberty Works Radio Network, you can go there and you can look at them as well. One of the things that they talk about, one of the many aspects of what they are presenting, is that the idea of the laws of natures and nature's God were the fundamentals within Christianity during the Reformation, and how that then spilt over into common law, and then how that spilt over into a covenantal law of governance, not just biblical covenantal law, but covenantal law of governance, which substantiates then what I always talk about is that, yes, the Constitution in reality is covenantal. And we're going to talk a little bit more on how you come to that conclusion when we get into the next segment. But that is interesting. I looked at these guys when I was updating the book for printing, and I really found that they had a lot of great work out there that was substantiating the work that I did in the book. And actually, in the third segment, I'm going to do something really unique, is that I'm going to walk you through the introduction of the book, and in the video presentation that you'll see up in the archives at where other than SamuelAdamsReturns.net, we'll go through some of those slides, and I will actually put those slides up in the video as we talk about them, because it's so important to understand the difference between man's laws and God's laws. And so when we look at all these shootings, when we look at all of the immorality, the Epsteins, everything else that is out there where I started, and all of the other media outsources, what's happening is they are focused on man's laws and not God's laws. So we have this great moral disconnect that is taking and causing all of the various issues, because we know, anybody here knows that this is the battle between good and evil, but something you have to be reminded of. God's won. He's already won. Jesus has arrived. He's here. He's died. He's brought salvation. Not only has he brought salvation, he has gone to sit at the Father, and everything is under his footstool. And when we as people, and especially the churches, come to that realization once again, we will go back to 1772 and understanding what it takes to have good governance. And that's what Sam Adams understood, and that's what the Anti-Federalists absolutely understood. And that's why we continue to look into the mirrors of history from those foundational perspectives of documents, truths, and people. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. Absolutely got it right. And again, this is Tom Navolis, your host. And we are going through a lot of information, as we always do, that is relative to what? Those mirrors in history. You know, one of the interesting aspects of the mirrors in history is I did a program back in September that is referenced in the archives here, that was talking about this blank space. Let me see, this blank space right here on the wall. I moved, but when I added the flag, the blank space got covered up a little bit. But this blank space, those in the video are seeing me with my left hand up and pointing to the blank space next to the flag for my JD from the University of Virginia. It's very interesting in that regard, because as I have now started communicating with the founders at Lo Nang Institute, it becomes apparent that the foundational way of teaching law was an appropriate way. When we talk about what we understand of the laws of nature and nature's God, and that all things are under his submission, it's looking at then the foundational writings and what that means. And not only that it looks at that the majority of people, because they came from that Puritan heritage, understood that God was over all, including law. He is the foundation of law. And I think that you'll find, and we'll walk through some of the things, is what I want to do here is I want to walk through some of the connections and links here on Lonang, LONANG.com, because I think it's important to understand that if you want to really make a difference in what is happening in America today, if you, even here in the state of Ohio or any other state, where Ohio we had the shootings in Dayton, in Texas, and El Paso, and all these other sporadic shootings all over the U.S., as terrible as those are for the victims, the fact of the matter is that we no longer honor the law of God. And when people don't really understand what it means not to murder, and not saying that the video games about shoot 'em up and, you know, all of that type of stuff is a major driver. No, that's just a component of it. The major driver is because the churches and the schools and even the homes, the families, are not giving that moral substance. And I will take the next couple of minutes to talk about that difference. So I will state this, as I think I may have said before, is that when I went in to talk to senior pastors at a particular large megachurch in Northeast Ohio, one of the most appalling statements that came out of that pastor's mouth in referencing the law of God, when I was talking about the law of God and everything is subservient to the law of God, and relative to the Ten Commandments being reinstituted into society, this pastor looked at me and very clearly said, well, we really don't pay attention and find that the Ten Commandments are that important. We believe that the law of God is put into the hearts of every individual, and with Christians, the Holy Spirit takes and, enunciates it. Something to that effect. I should have written it down, but all I can do now is paraphrase it. But this is part of the Gospel Coalition thinking, quite frankly. So you need to continue to do your homework on the Gospel Coalition. And what's important, and there's something that I learned, is that you've heard me speak about some of the writings that are out there that talk about the demise of our heart Christianity that started right around the early 1800s, but as we saw that Marxism came in, the social gospel came in, so on and so forth, we really saw that right about the Civil War and thereafter, that there were significant changes within what was happening at the pulpits. And we begin to see historically within the churches that there is a demise in the true gospel from what was there, say, in 1772. That you can reference, and I have references in the past. I'm not going to get to that right now, but the point is that one of the interesting things that I learned, the facts, not just a thing, one of the interesting facts that I learned in reading some of what is on the Lo Nang site is that around 1870, and this is may not get to jumping around in their site on things, but in 1870, the person that became the president of Harvard, and I don't have that one in front of me, I probably should have popped that reference for you, but what was happening in 1870 is a major transition in law and how law was looked at. And what was going on at that time prior to 1870 and how it was dribbling. So let's go back to Sam Adams, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and a lot of those that were learning the law during our foundation. They were learning the law based on the Bible. They were learning the law based on Blackstone's commentaries, which were of the English common law, which Blackstone talks about and says very, very clearly that it is the scriptures, it is God that sets the foundation for all law. Get that? Sets the foundation for all law. Let's jump ahead from that statement and just look then at what happened in Harvard at 1870. We saw that Harvard and all of the universities were starting to take and have what I call mental deficiency. They have mental deficiency because they no longer were looking at the biblical truths of who the Creator is and what He is as far as the sovereign of the universe, the sovereign of everything. And we know that in 1848, when the Communist Manifesto was put in place, we saw all of this socialist impact and communist impact moving in. 1848, now we're talking 1870. We just went through a civil war. Now we got this new president at Harvard. President at Harvard says, and he puts into place a whole different mechanism of how you study law and how you deal with law. He threw out, and I have not done the study on this, and it would be a very interesting study. He threw out all of that historical formulation of law based on biblical principle and truth. And he said, no, we have to look at law in relationship of precedent, in relationship of case law. So he instituted the methodology of teaching law as it derives from man. So this is where I really came to the point on today's program's title is The Law, Man versus God. Because what we continue to see is not just that battle from Genesis, but what we see is that we have distinctive shifts in America from how we even taught law and where the substance of law is to that from the sovereignty of God as the foundation of all law to now case law and man. And man is the final authority in law. So when we come to the present time, and I think, what do we got, 5 minutes left? We're back at that. I'm pretty good at finding that 6-minute mark. But when we take and we come now to looking at law, that what's happening is that the problems that are being executed out there, and that's what I call these shooters, they're executors, they're lawless, they're godless, and they're lawless. And what we found out about the Dayton shooter is that he is lawless to the point that he was a jihadist, in my opinion. In my definition, I'd call him a jihadist. So they haven't termed that yet as terrorism, but if I look at the circumstances, I would. But what do I know? They're still investigating. But the point is that when you take, and it's no longer God's law that's even in the schools or in the courtrooms, and it's only case law and man's law. Well, I did a audio version of Bastiat's The Law, and I did the front end of that audio version. And in that, in doing the research, is that we have so many state and federal laws on the books that when someone is taken and charged with something, the amount of what's going on historically on the charges is based on what's vogue at the time, what is getting the most opportunities to win a case at the time, and not what the law is. So what it comes down to is that even talking, breathing, and sleeping is against the law when you start studying the law in America. And with that, what we end up with is that, who are you? Who are you as another human being to take and make a law over me? Who are you as another human being that you say that we're a land ruled by laws, we're a land of law? Really? When you make up these laws, when you make up bureaucratic laws, what's in the bureaucratic books is greater than what's on the books from the Ohio Revised Code, or whatever revised code in whatever state you're in. More than what's codified in the U.S. Code. You know something? Who are you that you think that you can take and make up a law from? Who are you? You're not God. You're not a God. Oh, and the Constitution, well, we've been talking about socialism and communism and all the isms that are in our educational system. So if that's nothing and there's no historical significance to anything about the Constitution or that, then what are the laws? The laws are nothing. And do whatever I want to do because you're nothing. You see, that's the real difference. That is the travesty of what happened in 1870. When you take out the idea, more than the idea, when you take out the substantial connection to a supremacy of law, when you take out that more than just a relative position, when you take out an authority, when you take out the ultimate, final authority from everything to do with humanity, whether it's how the sun rises and sets and the moon comes on after that, when you take that out of the perspective of schools, homes, and yes, Gospel Coalition, churches, then you know what you have? Exactly what has happened in Dayton, El Paso, what's going on in Portland, what's going on all over this country with lawlessness. There's no final authority. And yeah, we can say, oh yeah, we got the police, we have all of this, we have a constitution, we have Ohio Revised Code, we have the U.S. Code, we have whatever state you live in code. Really? Who's the final authority? Not my neighbor. Not you, who I'm talking to. No. We who really believe in the foundation of this nation understand that the final and absolute authority and sovereign of all is the God of creation, the God of the universe, being the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Yes, I'm a Trinitarian, 100%. And you have to understand that it all has been given by the Father to Jesus under his footstool. So we have a final and ultimate authority. And everybody's going to find that out when they, leave this world. Sam Adams understood that, as well as those anti-federalists. And that's why they did challenge the Constitution, because they knew it had to be God's law. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. They absolutely got it right. And this is Tom Navolis, your host. And boy, this has been another packed program. And we have been looking at the mirrors of history and trying to understand the law, man versus God. We're introducing to you lawlessness.com, the very interesting site that I am enjoying. I've been interacting with them a lot more, but I was first introduced to them back in 2017, as I mentioned, as I point over my shoulder when I was revising from Covenant to the present Constitution. And in doing that, I found a document that they had that it helped substantiate for me my perspective on none other than covenant and constitutions. Instead of taking and trying to drive you through the whole site, I will again speak to you a little bit about this document that Mr. Titus and Mr. Thompson wrote on covenant and constitutions. They open it with a quote from Deuteronomy, as well as 1 Samuel, and that covenant as a framework is necessary for law and justice. And there's so much in here. And just the first paragraph, I'll read you the first two paragraphs, and then we're going to move on to some other things that I want to talk about with the book, because I told you I was going to take you through a few slides in there, but I wanted to cover a little bit on their website a little bit. But on this particular document, here's the first couple paragraphs. We have seen that a system of justice and authority must come from God, and that a government under the rule of law presupposes a civil ruler governed by the laws of God. Within this context, a covenant framework is necessary for the administration of law among men. We will now examine several biblical covenants in detail and use the principles learned from God's covenants with man to establish the pattern for covenants between man, including all forms of civil covenant, such as a constitution. The 7 biblical principles of covenant are justification of authority, reciprocity or mutuality, community, irrevocability, limited modifiability, bindingness on future generations, and the legal framework for the administration of law. You're going to see that I found a very similar perspective on these 7 biblical principles by what I will quote and show you in the slides here shortly. And then it goes on into the next paragraph. The framers of the U.S. Constitution were well aware of the biblical pattern of covenants and incorporated their understanding of covenants into the constitutional documents of America. Although the framers may not have expressed their understanding of biblical covenants in theological terms, there is a remarkable similarity of understanding. Okay, I got to say this one. There are 2 key truths to be learned from history. First, many of the documents of constitutional significance in America's history, including the U.S. Constitution, have incorporated the biblical principles of covenant in their terms. Word usage. The U.S. Constitution is not unique in this respect, but it is perhaps the best expression of this truth. Second, the primary features of civil covenants understood in the light of biblical principles are preeminence and supremacy. Preeminence and supremacy. I kind of talked about that in the last segment without having read all of this to you, but just knowing from all of my studies that those are key elements, preeminence and supremacy, for law to be substantiated and made sense of. Both of these features are expressed in Article 6, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution, popularly known as the Supremacy Clause. And it states, this Constitution's laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding. So that gets really interesting in the real complexity of what I mentioned in the segment number 2 is that when you start looking at bureaucratic rules, which become bureaucratic laws, and then which go into the ideas of case law, then what happens, instead of understanding the supremacy and who is the ultimate authority of all law, then when something takes and it goes through from a bureaucratic measure and is necessarily not even codified, but it's a bureaucratic stuff, that what happens with that bureaucratic stuff is that somebody sues on the basis of the bureaucratic stuff. Now that becomes a precedent that becomes substantiated by case law. And in fact, it should never be that way. But that is something that is why you need to go to lonang.com and understand some of the works and things that they were doing there. One of the interesting components that they bring out, that there's over 700 licensed lawyers, 700,000 licensed lawyers in the United States. So that means that there's one lawyer for every 430 Americans. Wow. Just so much stuff. Well, what I would like you also to go to is that when you go to Lonang, go to their commentaries and the curriculum. I don't think you're going to get a law degree out of this or anything like that. I don't know. I'm in conversations with them right now as to what this means if you complete this course. But the Lonang curriculum, it really goes through the transformation of American law, the place for truth in government, biblical principles of law, legal education, where law schools, including the CBN Regent University Law School, has abandoned the fundamentals that we're talking about here. And that one that is absolutely rejected is the Simon Greenleaf, now Trinity University of Law, and what their vision statement was in 1992. What is that all about? What is that legal education? What is it, what you get or don't get? And how has it gone from the laws of God now to the laws of man? Property, there's a lot on property, especially that's biblically covenantal established. Contracts, what is a vow? What is a contract? What does that look like? Crimes, what are crimes? Anything from what we're hearing in the media all over the place right now is sex, crimes, punishment. What's restitution versus punishment? And you have to understand, that's why de Tocqueville came to America in the 1830s, was because we didn't have a lot of prisons like they had in Europe. We didn't have a lot of people incarcerated as we do now. And you know the reason for that is because what I said earlier, before 1870 and the changes in how law was taught and everything was adjudicated, we actually looked at restitution and punishment instead of throwing people in jail. And because since the 60s, when the morality was taken out of the schools, anyway, I don't want to go through all of that. What is torts? What does that mean? Procedures, ethics, professional ethics. All right. That you can, and they got tons of other stuff in historical documents, so on and so forth. So go check out the site. So let's talk about the book. And for those behind or watching me on the video, I am reaching and turning and reaching behind me. I'm grabbing the book off the bookshelf and I'm going to hold it up for you. You know what? That's one of the ways that you can help fund this program and fund everything that we are doing is go buy the book. And for those within a 6-hour parameter, or let me say this, a 6-hour radii, distance, you know what? I'd consider coming and doing the presentations, and those are basically, it's an 8-hour day. It's a 6-hour presentation. Kathy just said I got 5 minutes. So what slides can I show you here real quick in just these next 6 minutes? Is that it all begins with covenant. And I'm going to take, and this slide will be up and is up in the video now, is that it begins with covenant, historical and biblical references to the suzerain treaties or covenant, Puritan founders understanding that of covenant, what it means. It's defined during the Reformation, covenantal commitments solidified by an oath, ratificatory versus unilateral oaths. The Scottish Covenanters, what did they talk about? God is the ultimate ruler, that society derives its patterns for all aspects of life from the biblical principles of governance, economy, and individual relational liberty. Compacts and charters were covenants with the king. All of this is in the book. This is just one of the slides in the presentation as we go through and talk about. And then the Constitution considered a compact with the people, thus it is a covenant. If it's a considered a compact, then that's exactly what it is. It is a covenant. The question of the covenantal model, and this is where I looked at the modeling different than what we talked about earlier. It goes into these things. Who's in charge? To whom do I report? What are the results? What happens to me if I obey or disobey? Does this outfit have a future? And then these are questions that need to be applied to every aspect of government, even within the context of the family. And then what happens is that we go into the rest of the slides and we talk about what's going on with covenant more in depth in that particular chapter in the book, as well as bringing in all of the various references. And then we go into everything that we were talking about in reference to law, is that we hear, all of us conservatives and constitutionalists and even the libertarians, will talk about uphold the Constitution. And many Americans believe they know what the Constitution says. I say, really? They don't. Not unless you take and you look at what some of the other references that I've always brought to you are from the Founders' Constitution. If you haven't studied through that, you don't know what the Constitution means. And I just learned of a new person that has some very interesting commentaries on the Constitution, a Dr. Kent. So I am learning and reading through those which were put together in the early 1800s. So with the majority not understanding what the Constitution really means, we end up with all of this other gobbledygook that we see that is going on. It creates opposing views, not by knowing original intent, that additionally lead to misunderstanding and misrepresentations. And so we get a lot of that, because now what we are seeing is the socialists, the communists, and all of the isms from the Omar 4 and the AOC makes it 5, or however it's being, lobbed around in social media and on the media, is the fact that they should never be representatives. If we understood original intent, and if people really understood the Constitution, those people would have never gotten elected. And in fact, if we really understood the Constitution, we really understood constitutional intent, and we understood that law comes from God, and we have that substantially imbued, inculcated into those that we are educating and that need to be educated, then we would see that anyone that comes into the United States needs to be inculcated into constitutionalism from original intent, because that's what the founders said, and that's what the founders intended. And so our immigration laws would not be the mess that they are, and we wouldn't even be having the conversation as we are having it. So, to that point in particular, What it is that Sam Adams and all the anti-federalists understood, and that's why they were anti-federalists, because they understood the underlying principles of governance, and they understood that the Constitution could become perverted because of the law, man versus God.